The dust was thick in the air, the sound of tank treads echoing through the ruined streets. Behind a pile of rubble, a 15-year-old German soldier named Klaus Becker clutched a Panzerfaust, shaking with fear. He had been told for years that surrender meant death, that the Americans were monsters, and they would show no mercy to captured soldiers. But as the American tanks rolled closer, Klaus knew he had only one choice: fight to the death or face unimaginable torture. He braced himself. But then, something impossible happened. The enemy spoke to him, not as a soldier, but as a boy. And for the first time, Klaus began to doubt everything he had ever been taught. Klaus had been trained for war since he was just 10 years old. He had spent his childhood in the Hitler Youth, learning that his life had a singular purpose: to fight for Germany. His nation was collapsing, and yet, here he was, still holding on to the beliefs that had been drilled into him from an early age. He was fighting not just to protect Germany, but to destroy the so-called enemy, the Americans. For years, he'd been told that they were barbaric monsters, that if captured, he would be tortured and executed. It was a fate he feared more than anything. But when the American soldiers finally surrounded him on that fateful day in 1945, Klaus couldn't believe what happened next. They didn't shoot him. They didn't torture him. Instead, they offered him water. The same soldiers who had been painted as heartless killers in the Nazi propaganda were treating him with kindness. It was a kindness Klaus could hardly comprehend, a kindness that contradicted everything he had ever believed about the enemy. For the first time in years, he questioned everything: the war, his training, and the lies that had shaped his reality. Klaus's mind raced as he stood there, paralyzed. The Panzerfaust, once a symbol of his resolve to fight to the death, now felt heavy and useless in his hands. The tank loomed before him, a massive iron beast. But the words that came from the soldier's mouth, "We won't shoot, come out, boy, weapons down," echoed in his ears. Boy, not enemy, not monster. Boy. For a moment, Klaus just stared at the soldiers. They were big, much bigger than he had imagined, their faces unreadable but not cruel. The one who spoke was black, something Klaus had been taught to fear most. Nazi propaganda had painted black soldiers as savage, even more so than the rest of the barbarians, and yet, here he was, offering Klaus a drink, with no malice in his eyes. The water was cool, refreshing, and as Klaus drank it, something inside him began to crack. The dry, dusty air had filled his lungs with fear for so long, and now, it was filling with something else, a kind of disbelief. The Americans, whom he had been taught to hate, were showing him kindness. They weren't the monsters he had been raised to believe. And Klaus set the Panzerfaust down slowly, his arms trembling as he did. It was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but a new weight had replaced it: the weight of realization. He wasn't going to die, not today, not in the way he had imagined. And for the first time, Klaus felt something he hadn't in months: hope. The soldiers gestured toward the other posts being gathered, their hands steady as they directed Klaus to join them. No execution, no torture, no cruelty, just a simple, unfathomable kindness. Klaus couldn't process it. His entire life had been built on lies: the belief that Americans were inhuman, that surrender meant death, and yet, he was being treated like a human being. He walked toward the others, dazed, as the world he knew fell apart. He was just a boy, after all, caught in the web of a war he never chose, and in that moment, it wasn't the uniform that defined him. It was the humanity in the hands that offered him water, in the eyes that showed concern instead of hatred. It was a moment that would change him forever. Klaus Becker stood frozen, the weight of the Panzerfaust pressing against his thin shoulders. His body trembled with fear, exhaustion, and the unbearable hunger that had gnawed at him for days. The once proud uniform hung loosely on his frame, and the Volkssturm armband felt like a shackle, tightening around his bicep with every passing second. Through the thick smoke and dust of the devastated Kreuzberg district, he could hear them approaching: the grinding treads of American tanks, the shouts of soldiers in English. It was clear now, there was nowhere left to run. His small group of frightened boys had been pushed to the edge of the city, cornered by the advancing enemy. Klaus gripped the Panzerfaust, the one weapon he had been given in his desperate, hopeless defense. His mind raced, the propaganda he had been fed for years repeating in his head. Americans were monsters, barbarians, killers who showed no mercy to prisoners. The images of torture and execution that had been burned into his mind made surrender unthinkable. The tank was now close, only about 30 meters away, but Klaus hesitated. He was supposed to fire. That's what he had been trained to do. But everything in him screamed to run, to hide, to fight back, anything but stand there. paralyzed by fear. As the tank rumbled closer, Klaus could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He raised the weapon, his hands shaking uncontrollably, trying to recall the few instructions he had been given. Aim, fire. His body screamed to do something, anything. But his thoughts were still stuck in the words his commanding officer had shouted. Better to die for the fur than surrender to beasts. Suddenly, the tank stopped. Klaus's finger found the trigger, but before he could pull it, a voice boomed from across the wreckage. Put the weapon down. Boy, step out. Klaus's heart skipped a beat. The word boy was not a threat, not an enemy label. It was something entirely different. The American soldiers weren't calling him a monster, weren't treating him like a target. They were calling him boy. He froze, uncertain, still gripped by the fear and indoctrination that had been his truth for so long. But the voice came again, softer this time, more insistent. We won't shoot. Just come out and drop the weapon. Klaus's mind screamed that this was a trick, that if he stepped out, they would shoot him. He couldn't let go of the Panzerfaust. He couldn't, but somehow, the soldier's calm tone reached him, and for a moment, his mind cracked. The years of propaganda of fear and hatred started to unravel. Slowly, his shaking hands placed the Panzerfaust on the ground. His arms rose above his head, trembling with the weight of what he was doing. Don't shoot, Klaus cried, his voice cracking with panic. 3 American soldiers emerged from behind the tank, rifles raised, but they didn't fire. Instead, one of them, larger than the others, stepped forward, his face soft but firm. He didn't look at Klaus with anger, but with a kind of detached concern. Put it down, kid. We're not here to hurt you, the soldier said in broken German, his words carrying an unexpected kindness that Klaus hadn't anticipated. This wasn't a monster. This was just a man. Klaus didn't know what to do. His mind couldn't process what was happening. He had been trained to die fighting, to believe that Americans were evil. He had been prepared for death, not mercy. He stood there, confused, his arms still raised. The soldier stepped closer, offering him a canteen. Trinken, the soldier said softly, his voice comforting. Drink. Klaus hesitated, staring at the canteen. This was impossible. This was the enemy, the very people who had been painted as heartless monsters. But here they were, offering him water, a simple gesture of care, not cruelty. With trembling hands, Klaus took the canteen. The water was cool, refreshing, something he hadn't tasted in weeks. He drank deeply, the thirst of his body finally quenched. As he pulled away from the canteen, his eyes met the soldiers, and for the first time, Klaus saw something he couldn't understand: concern, humanity. The soldier gave him a brief nod and gestured toward the rear. Klaus looked behind him. Other German prisoners, many of them boys like him, were sitting together, eating, drinking, being treated with care. This wasn't what he had been told would happen. There were no executions, no torture, no bloodshed. Instead, there was water, there was food, there was life. Klaus slowly turned toward the others, walking toward them in a daze, still unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. His world had been built on lies, but now, those lies were dissolving. He had been told that surrender meant death. He had been told that Americans would kill him. And yet, here he was, alive, receiving the care he had been taught to fear. The other boys were eating. Some of them were still hesitant, looking around at their captors with suspicion. But others had already started eating with the same cautious optimism that Klaus was now feeling. Klaus sat down beside them, still in shock, his mind raced, trying to understand the truth of what had just occurred. He had been told that the Americans were monsters, but he had been wrong. For the first time in his life, Klaus didn't feel like a soldier. He felt like a scared, hungry, tired boy, a boy who had been fed lies his whole life. And now, for the first time in days, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The shock of the truth began to sink in, and Klaus realized that in that moment, everything he had been taught about his enemies had been wrong. He had been taught to fight, to die for the Führer, to believe that the Americans were evil. But instead, the enemy had shown him mercy. They had saved his life, and for that, Klaus would never forget. Klaus sat quietly among the other prisoners, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He had been conditioned from a young age to see the Allies, especially the Americans, as the worst kind of enemy, capable of only cruelty and destruction. But as he looked around at the soldiers who were treating him with care, offering food, water, and kindness, his entire worldview began to crumble. The camp, though small and rudimentary, was nothing like the nightmarish prison camps he had imagined. There were no iron bars, no screams of pain. Instead, it was filled with a strange kind of order and calm. something he hadn't expected from the barbaric Americans he had been taught to fear. The soldiers here were not tormentors, they were just people. People who were doing their job, following rules, treating prisoners with respect. Klaus tried to focus on the sounds of the camp, the faint hum of radios, the clinking of metal as prisoners ate their rations. The American soldiers, many of them just a few years older than Klaus himself, went about their duties with quiet professionalism. They weren't monsters. They were soldiers who had a job to do, just like him. But unlike Klaus, they didn't believe their job included killing children. Klaus couldn't stop the flood of confusion in his mind. Everything he had learned, everything he had been taught his whole life had been built on lies. The world he had fought for, the ideals of the Reich, were a lie. His enemies, the Americans, were showing him more humanity than he had ever received from his own government. Later that evening, Klaus found himself sitting on a bench beside another captured boy, Friedrich. The two of them exchanged quiet glances, both unsure of what to say. Their whole lives had been consumed by fear, by the need to fight and survive. But now, they were here, sitting in a camp, not as prisoners of war, but as human beings. It felt strange, even wrong. "I thought they would kill us," Klaus whispered to Friedrich, his voice barely audible. "I thought they would torture us." Friedrich shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with disbelief. "I thought the same," he murmured. "But they didn't. They gave us food. They gave us water. It's not what we were told." Klaus stared ahead, his mind still reeling. He thought about all the things he had been taught, the hatred, the fear, the lies about the Americans. But now, he could see that it was all false. The propaganda had painted a picture of a ruthless enemy, a picture that had no basis in reality. The Americans, the very people he had been taught to hate, had shown him mercy. They had saved him when he had expected death. The change inside Klaus was gradual but undeniable. His distrust of the American soldiers slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe. He couldn't understand it fully, but the more he saw of the kindness they showed him, the more his beliefs were shattered. One day, as Klaus sat quietly in the camp, an American medic came to check on him. The medic was a young man, no older than Klaus himself, with a gentle face and eyes that spoke of exhaustion but also kindness. "Hey, how are you feeling?" the medic asked, his voice soft as he approached Klaus. Klaus hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had been taught that soldiers like this one would never care for him. But here he was, offering care, offering kindness, offering a glimpse of something he had never known before. I'm okay," Klaus said, his voice unsure. The medic nodded and smiled. "Good, you've been through a lot, just rest. If you need anything, you let me know." Klaus watched the medic walk away, the kindness of the encounter settling over him like a blanket. His whole life had been filled with the belief that the enemy was heartless, that they would never show him anything but cruelty. But now, with each passing day, he saw that the true enemy wasn't the Americans, it was the lies he had been taught to believe. As the days passed, Klaus found himself beginning to trust the soldiers around him, even speaking to some of them. They were just people, after all, people who had families, dreams, and hopes, just like him. In the quiet moments of the camp, the walls of fear he had built around himself began to crumble. Klaus was no longer a soldier, and the people around him were no longer enemies. They were fellow human beings, each of them trying to survive, to heal, to find some sense of peace after the madness of war. By the time the days began to blur into one another, Klaus had started to understand what it meant to be treated like a human again. The mental shift was subtle, like the slow change of seasons. What had started as disbelief now started to feel like a new truth, one he couldn't ignore. As he spent more time with his fellow prisoners and the American soldiers, the difference in treatment was stark, almost jarring. The camp was a place of strange contradictions, a mix of fear and healing, of hostility and unexpected kindness. Klaus couldn't reconcile the world he had fought for with the reality he was now living. He couldn't understand how the soldiers he had once been told to hate could show him compassion. Yet, day by day, that reality became more undeniable. One evening, after a long day spent doing nothing but sitting and reflecting, Klaus found himself standing by the fence of the camp. He watched as American soldiers went about their work, talking to one another, smiling, laughing. It was a peaceful, ordinary scene, something he'd never thought he would see in the midst of war. The contrast between what he had been taught and the reality of what he was witnessing hit him hard. He was so deep in thought that he didn't notice the American soldier who walked up beside him until he spoke. "You all right, kid?" the soldier asked, his tone soft, his eyes scanning Klaus's face. Klaus looked up at the soldier. unsure how to respond. What was there to say? How could he explain that everything he had believed had been shattered in a matter of days? He had been raised on a foundation of lies, and now those lies had crumbled before his eyes. I don't know, Klaus said finally, his voice low. I thought you were all monsters. The soldier gave him a thoughtful look, not offended, just curious. Yeah, I know. That's what they've been telling you, huh? Klaus nodded, his stomach twisting at the thought of everything he had been taught. Listen, the soldier continued. I'm sorry for what you were told. What you heard, it's not true. We're not monsters. We're just regular people, trying to get through this mess, just like you. All of us. Klaus swallowed hard, feeling something shift inside him. It was a realization, one that didn't come all at once, but rather seeped in slowly, like a dawn breaking over the horizon. The Americans weren't monsters. The real monsters were the lies and the manipulation, the years of propaganda that had twisted everything he had believed. That night, Klaus lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, processing everything he had learned in the past few days. He had been so ready to die for Germany, so convinced that his death would be noble, heroic. But now, with each passing hour, he understood something deeper. Survival wasn't about sacrifice, it was about humanity. It was about living to see another day, about forgiving and being forgiven. The next morning, as the sun rose over the camp, Klaus found himself walking toward the group of American soldiers, gathered around the camp's central area. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he needed to say something. As he approached the soldiers, one of them, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, looked up and caught his eye. Hey, kid, the man said with a grin, you doing all right today? For the first time, Klaus didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and, in his halting German, said, I want to thank you. The soldier raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. Thank me? For what? For not killing me, Klaus said, the words coming out almost involuntarily. For showing me that I'm not just a soldier, I'm a person. The soldier's face softened. Hey, kid, he said, his voice kind. We don't kill kids, no matter what side you're on, and we never wanted you to be part of this mess. Klaus didn't know what to say to that. His entire life had been dedicated to a cause that had ultimately betrayed him. But standing here, in front of this soldier, the words didn't matter as much as the feeling that filled him, a feeling of unexpected peace. Over the following days, Klaus found himself slowly integrating into the daily routine of the camp. He spoke to more soldiers, some of whom were more curious than others about his life back in Germany. They asked him about his family, about his hometown, about what life had been like before the war had shattered everything. And with each conversation, Klaus felt the weight of the lies he had been taught lift off his shoulders just a little bit more. He began to see the Americans not as the monstrous enemy, but as people, just like him, just like the soldiers who had fought for the Reich and were now sitting alongside him, sharing food and offering words of encouragement. As time passed, Klaus began to understand that the war, for all its brutality and violence, was not the end of the story. There was more to life than hatred and division. There was forgiveness, there was mercy, and those things, as he was beginning to realize, were stronger than any of the weapons they had used to fight. The days in the camp felt like an eternity, but for Klaus, every moment was a revelation. It was as if he were being reborn into a world where the lines between right and wrong, good and evil, had been erased. The black and white world of propaganda was now a gray landscape, filled with shades of humanity he had never imagined. And it was only through direct experience that Klaus began to understand what had been hidden from him all his life: the capacity for mercy, even in the midst of war. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the world around Klaus changed once again. He had heard the whispers the day before, rumors of surrender, of the collapse of the Reich, of an end to the madness. But he had dismissed them as nothing more than wishful thinking. It wasn't until he heard the announcement through the camp's loudspeakers that it became real. The war was over. For a brief moment, Klaus felt nothing. It wasn't relief or joy or even sorrow. It was an overwhelming emptiness, as though the world he had fought for, the world that had shaped him, had simply disappeared. What did it mean? The end of the war. What did it mean for someone like him, a child soldier who had fought for a cause that was no longer? In the days that followed, the camp was filled with a strange energy. The air seemed thick with anticipation, yet tinged with an uncomfortable uncertainty. The American soldiers moved more freely now, some of them celebrating, others looking inward, reflecting on the cost of it all. Klaus had never seen them this way before, still human, but free from the war that had gripped their lives for so long. Klaus walked among them, still wearing his Volkssturm uniform, feeling out of place. He was supposed to be the enemy, the one they had fought against. But now, what was he? Just a boy and innocent in the eyes of those who had once been his enemies. It wasn't until one afternoon, while sitting under the shade of a tree, that Klaus had a chance encounter that would shape the rest of his life. A young American soldier, no older than Klaus himself, sat beside him. The soldier was holding a book, his eyes focused on the pages. Klaus had never spoken to him before, but there was something familiar in his face, something that made Klaus feel as though they were connected, as though they had shared a history together, even though they had never met. After a few minutes of silence, the soldier looked up and smiled. "I'm Paul," he said, offering a handshake. Klaus took his hand cautiously, unsure of what to make of the situation. "Klaus," he replied, his voice hesitant. "You're German," Paul said, his voice calm, but there was an undertone of curiosity. "I was," Klaus corrected him softly. "I'm not sure what I am now." Paul nodded, as if he understood exactly what Klaus meant. "Yeah," he said, "it's all pretty confusing, huh?" They sat there for a while, exchanging glances and awkward silences, both unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. But in that moment, something strange happened, something that could only be understood in the aftermath of war. For the first time in Klaus's life, he felt truly seen. Not as a soldier, not as an enemy, but as a person, someone who had been caught up in something far beyond his control. Someone who had been shaped by forces that neither he nor anyone else had fully understood. The soldier Paul didn't see a Nazi, didn't see an enemy. He saw a kid who had been thrown into a war, just like he had. "I don't know what happens now," Klaus said quietly. "Where do we go from here?" Paul looked at him thoughtfully, his face softening. "I don't know either," he admitted, "but wherever we go, I think we'll be okay. You know, it's not over for us. We have the chance to make something of this, something better." Klaus felt a lump form in his throat. He had never heard anyone talk like that. In all the years of indoctrination, in all the months of war, no one had ever spoken to him like that. He had been taught that peace was impossible, that the world could never heal from the wounds of war. But now, sitting in the shade with a former enemy, Klaus began to wonder if maybe there was hope after all. It wasn't just about the war being over. It was about what came after it, the possibilities, the rebuilding. As the days went by, Klaus found himself becoming more and more integrated into the camp's new rhythm. The days of tension, of fear, of survival, began to fade into the background. The soldiers treated him with kindness, even as they began to prepare for the inevitable repatriations. It felt strange to think about returning to Germany, a country in ruins, a land filled with ghosts and memories. But it wasn't just about returning to a broken home. It was about moving forward into a world that had changed forever, and Klaus, for the first time, felt like he could be a part of that new world. As he sat by the campfire one night, listening to the crackling of the flames, he thought back to the day when he had raised his hands in surrender, the moment when he had dropped his weapon and stepped into the unknown. That moment had shattered everything he had believed, and now, surrounded by soldiers who had once been his enemies, Klaus felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The kind of hope that came not from victory, but from mercy. The kind of hope that came from the unexpected kindness of strangers, from the willingness to rebuild even when everything seemed lost. And for the first time, Klaus believed that maybe, just maybe, the future could be different. The weeks that followed the end of the war were filled with a strange mixture of relief and confusion for Klaus and the other young prisoners. It wasn't just the shock of survival, it was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The world they had known, a world shaped by the relentless machinery of war, had collapsed. And in its place, there was a vast emptiness, an uncharted landscape where the old rules no longer applied. For Klaus, every day was a step further from the boy he had been. Every interaction with the American soldiers, every act of kindness they showed, forced him to confront the falsehoods he had been fed for years. He had been taught to believe in a world of black and white, where the enemy was evil, and the only way to survive was to fight to the death. Now, as he sat with the other boys, some of whom were still too young to fully comprehend the depth of what had happened, he realized that there was more to life than the rigid confines of ideology. The American soldiers, who had once been his enemies, had become his teachers. Through their actions, they showed him the true meaning of humanity. They had spared his life, treated him with dignity, and given him a future that had once seemed impossible. As the days turned into weeks, the American forces began to prepare for the repatriation of the German prisoners. Klaus, along with the other young prisoners, was taken to a holding camp where they were processed for transport back to Germany. The camp, though still surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers, was a far cry from the hellish conditions he had expected. The food was plentiful, the medical care was compassionate, and the guards were respectful. It felt surreal to Klaus, like a dream from which he might wake at any moment. One day, as he sat under a tree in the camp, a young American soldier approached him. The soldier, who had been kind to Klaus from the beginning, sat down beside him. "How are you holding up?" the soldier asked, his voice gentle. Klaus looked up at him, feeling an unfamiliar sense of gratitude. "Better than I ever thought I would," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I still can't believe. I thought I was going to die." The soldier smiled softly. "We all did what we had to do, right? No one wants to fight, not really. But sometimes, you do what you have to." Klaus nodded. He didn't fully understand the soldier's words, but he understood the sentiment. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just a cog in a war machine, he was a person, with the possibility of a future. As the day of his repatriation approached, Klaus found himself filled with a strange mixture of emotions. He knew that returning to Germany meant facing the destruction, the loss, and the disillusionment that awaited him. But he also knew that he wasn't the same boy who had crossed the Rhine River in fear. He had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild his life in a world that was no longer defined by hatred and propaganda. The morning of the repatriation arrived with an air of finality. Klaus, along with the other boys, was given a set of clean clothes and told to gather his belongings. As he walked toward the transport truck that would take him back to Germany, he couldn't help but look back at the American soldiers who had shown him kindness. One of the soldiers, the same one who had given him water weeks ago, walked over to him. "Good luck, Klaus," the soldier said, shaking his hand. "I hope you find peace." Klaus didn't know how to respond. The words felt heavy in his mouth, but as he looked into the soldier's eyes, he realized that there was something more important than words. There was a shared understanding, a bond forged through the most unlikely of circumstances. "I will," Klaus said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. The transport truck rumbled to life, and Klaus climbed aboard with the other boys. As they drove away from the camp, Klaus glanced back one last time. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The world had changed, and so had he. The journey back to Germany was long, filled with silence and a deep, unfamiliar weight. Klaus sat among the other boys, each of them lost in their thoughts. The landscape outside the truck windows was a blur. Fields, roads, and villages they passed through felt like fragments of a life that no longer existed. Klaus's thoughts wandered to the family he'd left behind. His mother, who had once been a strong, unshakable presence, was now a shadow of the woman he remembered. His father, lost in the chaos of the Eastern Front, was no longer part of the world Klaus was returning to. He had been told nothing about the state of his home, his family, or the future. The only thing he knew for sure was that he was going back to a country that had been destroyed, physically and ideologically. When the transport truck finally reached the outskirts of Berlin, Klaus's heart sank. The city, once the beating heart of Nazi power, was now a pile of rubble. The once proud streets were littered with debris, broken buildings, and the remnants of lives torn apart by war. Klaus's thoughts raced as the truck slowly made its way through the city, past bombed-out buildings and streets he had once known so well. They arrived at a processing center where the boys would be officially repatriated. The camp, though still surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by German soldiers, was a far cry from the one Klaus had left behind in America. There were no American soldiers offering them water or chocolate bars, only the cold, sterile reality of a world that was now ruled by devastation and despair. Klaus stood in line with the other boys, trying to shake off the sense of loss and disbelief that seemed to follow him like a shadow. When it was his turn, he was handed a small bundle of clothes and some rations. He was then told to find his family if they were still alive and begin rebuilding his life. But as he stood there, surrounded by the ruins of the world he had known, Klaus wasn't sure where to begin. He left the processing center and made his way through the city, stopping at the places that once held memories of a life before the war. He passed the old school where he had been taught the virtues of loyalty to the fatherland, the streets where he had once played with his friends, and the building where his family had lived before it was destroyed by Allied bombing. When he finally reached what was left of his family's home, it was barely recognizable. The walls were reduced to piles of stone, the windows shattered, and the door hanging off its hinges. His heart sank as he stepped through the rubble, calling out for his mother, but no answer came. He wandered through the wreckage, unsure of where to go or what to do next. It was then that he saw her, his mother, standing among the ruins, looking as fragile as the city around them. She was thinner than Klaus remembered, her face drawn with the weight of the years. But when she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Klaus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought you were dead." Klaus rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. For a moment, nothing else mattered, nothing but the feeling of being home, of being with the one person who had never given up hope. But as they stood there, surrounded by the broken city and the ghosts of the past, Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that the war had taken more than just his home and family. It had taken something from him that he wasn't sure he could ever get back. In the days that followed, Klaus tried to rebuild his life, but it wasn't easy. The memories of the war still haunted him, and the world he had returned to felt foreign and unrecognizable. The propaganda that had shaped his entire existence had crumbled, but it had left behind scars that couldn't be healed overnight. Klaus began to work with his mother, helping her rebuild what little they could from the remnants of their home. They grew vegetables in the small garden, and Klaus helped repair the roof and walls. Slowly, they started to piece together a life in the ruins of Berlin. But there was a lingering sense of emptiness. Klaus had seen things during the war that he couldn't forget, and the realization that the world he had believed in was a lie was a heavy burden to carry. One day, as Klaus sat by the garden, looking out at the city's skyline, he thought back to his time in the American camp. He thought about the soldiers who had treated him with kindness, the medic who had saved his life, and the black American soldier who had handed him water. They had shown him something that he had never thought possible: mercy, compassion, humanity in the face of unimaginable violence. He had been taught to fear them, to hate them, but they had shown him the truth. Klaus realized that, in many ways, the war had taken everything from him: his home, his family, his innocence, but it had also given him something. It had given him the ability to see the world through new eyes, to understand that even in the darkest of times, there was still light, still hope, still humanity. As the weeks passed and Klaus continued to rebuild his life, he made a decision. He would not let the war define him. He would not let it take away the possibility of a future. He would honor the memories of those he had lost, but he would not live in the shadow of the past. He began to study, learning English from old books and letters he had received from the American soldiers who had treated him. He started to understand the depth of the mercy he had been shown, and he knew that he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. It was a slow process, but Klaus was determined. The boy who had once been a soldier for a broken cause was now learning to be a man of peace. And though the scars of war would never fully fade, Klaus had found a new purpose, a new way forward in a world that had been shattered by conflict. As the war ended, the streets of Berlin were in ruins, and so was Klaus Becker's understanding of the world. A 15-year-old boy, thrown into battle, now faced the aftermath. The once strong ideas of loyalty to the Führer crumbled beneath the weight of reality. His body, now scarred by war, found itself at the mercy of his captors, Americans, the very people he had been taught to fear and hate. Klaus expected death. Instead, he found something far more unsettling: mercy. When Klaus dropped his weapon and stepped into the open, terrified of the soldiers who stood before him, he couldn't understand what was happening. They didn't shoot. They didn't hurt him. Instead, they handed him water and food. It was a simple gesture, but one that shattered everything Klaus had ever been told. The American soldiers didn't see him as an enemy. They saw a frightened boy, a victim of war, just like them. For Klaus, that act of kindness was incomprehensible. How could the people he had been taught to hate offer him compassion instead of cruelty? That moment marked the beginning of Klaus's journey into a new world. A world where mercy, not violence, had the power to heal. A world where enemies could become allies. And most importantly, a world where he was no longer a soldier but a human being again. Months after his release, Klaus lived quietly with his mother in the wreckage of Berlin. The city smelled of dust and smoke, and every wall carried the weight of defeat. Yet, amid the ruins, Klaus found something unexpected: peace. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore an American postmark. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a short note written in careful handwriting. To Klaus Becker, I hope you are well. I don't know if you remember me, but I gave you water the day you surrendered. I wanted you to know you made the right choice. The war is over, and so is hate. Be free, boy, live well. Sergeant William Hayes, U.S. Army. Klaus read the letter again and again. It wasn't long, but it meant everything. He folded it neatly and kept it in his pocket, like a shield against the darkness that still lingered in post-war Germany. For months, he helped his mother rebuild their small home. He worked long hours clearing rubble, repairing windows, planting vegetables in dead soil. But every night, he'd take out that letter and read it again. It reminded him that mercy existed, that humanity had survived the ruins. He began teaching neighborhood children English from the words he'd learned in the camp. Water, he'd say, smiling faintly. It means life. Years later, in 1965, Klaus Becker stood on a quiet street in Bonn, now a grown man with lines of experience etched across his face. He had become a teacher, not of war, but of peace. The nightmares of his youth still came, but softer now, more distant. One morning, he received another letter, this one from America. Inside was a photograph. 3 soldiers stood smiling near a tank. On the back, a message was written. Found this old photo from 1945. Thought you'd like to see the faces that chose mercy that day. William. Klaus sat down, the letter trembling in his hands, his eyes filled with tears. The faces in the photo were older now, but he remembered them. The men who had chosen not to kill a terrified boy behind the rubble. He placed the picture in a small wooden frame on his desk. Below it, he wrote a single line in German. Man kann den Feind besiegen. In the Man in Am Leben list, you can defeat the enemy by letting him live. When Klaus died in 1993, that framed photo sat beside his bed. His students, who had never known war, often asked why he never spoke about his past. He'd smile gently and reply, because the real story isn't about war. It's about what came after. And so, a boy once trained to hate became a man who taught compassion. Because one day, in May 1945, a soldier handed him water and changed the course of his life.